Hey, what is going on? Today, we're going to go back out of the brain. I'm going to go back to the brain a little later, but I think I need to get the um, the somatic nervous system out of the way a bit. It's not of like primary interest to me, but it's needed. We need to understand the somatic nervous system in order to have a complete understanding of the nervous system. And today is February 5th, 2022. And this is basically where I'm at. And the sensory nervous system is obviously, somatic nervous system is obviously quite important because it's how your brain talks to your body and how your body communicates with your outside environment. So your nerves, your nerve fibers, everything, all the neurons that are not within your spinal cord or your brain directly, but still accept stimulus from outside of your brain, are part of the somatic nervous system. And your somatic nervous system contains reflex arcs. I mean, they contain different neurons which allow the formation and the maintenance of reflex arcs. So what are reflex arcs? So reflex arcs are your reflexes essentially. So when you touch, the canonical example is when you touch a hot stove or something like that, your hand will immediately move backwards because you don't have time to think about it. Your evolution has kind of designed your body to automatically react. So your brain doesn't, and it is not necessarily even involved right away with this reflex that you have, right? Your brain does get a sensation of the reflex that you felt that's translated in one of your brain structures to hot or cold or whatnot, but the actual reflex, the action of your hand moving backwards, is controlled by, is pretty much, it's a function of input that's directly fed back from your sensory neuron to your spinal cord and to your motor neuron, which causes immediate pullback from the harmful stimulus. All right, so that involves us talking a little bit more about sensory neurons and motor neurons, and I think I've talked a little bit about that before, except it's quite a big deal. And where I talked about it was when describing the different structures of neurons. So you've seen this before when I pulled up sensory neurons. You've seen the different types of different polarity neurons, right? So you have the unipolar, bipolar, pseudo-unipolar, which are pseudo-unipolar neurons are actually sensory neurons. This multipolar neuron is the kind of neuron that you see in your brain, pretty much. But and your bipolar neuron is also a sensory neuron. So these neurons that don't have many dendrites hanging off of the soma cell body are called are usually delegated to these neurons, these somatic nervous system neurons. Okay, so the interesting thing, right, and this is a better classification, right, like the motor neurons, like the sensory neurons are these unipolar ones. And that's interesting about these is that like the multipolar motor neurons that are part of your central nervous system, these are not your peripheral nervous system. These hang go outside of the ventral part of your spinal cord, but they kind of stay within the gray matter region in the spinal cord, and they can either connect to other sensory neurons that provide the stimulus to them, or they can connect to an interneuron, which an interneuron is like an intermediate neuron that connects a sensory neuron, one of these motor neurons, to a sensory neuron. So like that's this kind of bipolar neuron that sits within the muscle cell, right, interneuron. Not within the muscle cell, within the spinal cord itself. So that's basically what happens there. And so this is a better diagram of like what the different functions of these sensory the somatic nervous system neurons are. And the somatic nervous system also, I should just step back a little bit, right? You have this part of your somatic nervous system which is responsible for that's your voluntary movements, right? So for instance, if I decide I want to move my hands back and forth, right, the somatic nervous system is what comes into play. But if I want to, let's say, my autonomic nervous system, the autonomic nervous system is also part of the peripheral nervous system, is related to stuff I don't want to do necessarily, like that automatic reflex arc. So you have your autonomic nervous system, you have your peripheral nervous system, and they both are part of your autonomic and sensory nervous system, which are both part of your peripheral nervous system. And so your sensory, going back into a little deeper into the actual connections of the neurons, right? So this is kind of like a different categorization view of the neurons. So your motor neurons are connected directly to muscle cells, right? So this is like a muscle cell down here, and this is your standard axon, which we've gone over before, which is myelinated and contains and has nodes of Ranvier in between to reinforce the action potential. At this receptor, motor neuron receptor here, we've talked about this before as well. This is the muscle which is stimulated by your motor neuron through acetylcholine, right? Your motor neuron gets a signal, produces, there's acetylcholine at the synapses, which gets unpackaged and sent into the synaptic cleft, which then connect to acetylcholine receptors, which then open sodium channels and create action potential within your muscle cells, and then those eventually close when acetylcholine esterase comes by and breaks off those acetylcholine molecules attached to those receptors into acetylcholine and into acetate and choline, which are then recycled again. So basically, that's what's happening on the muscle level as far as your neurotransmitters are concerned. And then this is your interneuron. This is like the relay. So sometimes you need this relay in your body. I'm not actually sure when an interneuron is needed versus when just a direct connection between a motor and sensory neuron is needed. But that's also known as that's also known as a polysynaptic versus monosynaptic connection. So when an interneuron is involved in a connection between a sensory and motor neuron, it's called a polysynaptic bridge, because there's multiple synapses involved in this connection to dendrites, etc. But if there's just the motor neuron connected to the sensory neuron, I assume 4 different arcs, maybe the autonomic arc has this situation going on, then you have monosynaptic connection. Okay, so let's go to the motor neurons a bit. This is actually we probably want to look at more the spinal cord now. So in the spinal cord, right, I'm just looking at one cross section of the spinal cord here. You basically have the only thing that's interesting right now to kind of talk about is this is where the neuronal space is, right here in this gray region. All right, and this front side, this ventral side, is where motor neurons exit from this gray matter region. Then this dorsal side, the back side, is where a sensory neuron will enter. And that sensory neuron will get that stimulus from the brain, or get the stimulus from a signal from the brain, or from the external environment, like the skin. And so it will just immediately send its action and then reaction, right? So I'm looking for right here. So basically, you have you just have the internal, and this section of the spinal cord has its own nervous sections with your motor neurons and sensory neurons going in and out. So that's all I'm going to get into today. Well, one thing I do want to talk about, one other thing, is this dorsal root ganglia. I like demystifying complex words when it comes to the nervous system. So this dorsal root ganglia is a connection. It's part of your sensory neuron. So that is this part here. This is your dorsal root. And then you have your ventral root. Your ventral root is where your motor neuron exits. Your dorsal root is where your sensory neuron enters. And this sympathetic ganglion here, this is like, there's many neurons, by the way, along this path. So there's some redundancy here, I believe. But sometimes there's only one neuron in a specific part of your muscle. So you have to wonder what happens if there's like severing of the neurons or whatnot. How effective will your muscle be at responding to stimuli or things like that, or if there's blocking of acetylcholine somehow, then that's another situation. So lots of stuff to get into there. Don't have time to talk about it, but I just wanted to kind of point out the dorsal section here, because when we talk about the dorsal, the DRG, right, we can just have a reference to what that is exactly. Okay, so that's it for today. I'll see you later. Tomorrow, I'm hoping my next lecture will be a little less all over the place and haphazard.